Okay. So we are very excited to open this year's seminar series with Professor Martin Hebart, who is a professor for computational cognitive neuroscience and quantitative psychiatry at Justus Liebig University at Gießen and an independent Max Planck research group leader at the Max Planck Institute. Sorry, somebody has asked me to record, so okay. And an independent Max Planck research group leader at the Max Planck Institute of Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig, Germany. Professor Hebart obtained his PhD with John Dylan Haynes and Tobias Stoner at the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience in Berlin and was supported by a scholarship from the German National Academic Foundation. After his postdoc at Jan Glaischer's lab, at the University Medical Center Hamburg-Eppendorf, he received a Humboldt Fellowship to work with Chris Baker at NIMH. After his postdoc, he moved back to Germany to set up his own vision and computational cognition research group at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig. And a few years later, he became a Lau professor of computational cognitive neuroscience at the Justus Liebig University in Gießen. He's a recipient of an ERC Starting Grant Award. He has created the Decoding Toolbox, a widely used tool for decoding mental states from patterns of brain activity. He's also known for developing the Things Object and Concept database, spanning more than 26,000 object images, and is a founder of the Things Initiative at things-initiative.org, which promotes the public sharing of data sets using things for an interdisciplinary multiscale study of object recognition and understanding. He publishes in top leading journals as Nature, Human Behavior, Nature, Machine Intelligence, PNAS, Brain, Scientific Data, and more. His research focuses on visual perception and cognition, investigating how humans make sense of visual information that eventually leads to recognizing the objects in our environment despite dramatic variability in position, size, shape, or texture, and how do people make meaningful decisions about the visual world around us. His current research is focused on revealing core representational principles in the visual system and how they enable object understanding and effective behavior. He combines methods from cognitive psychology, such as psychophysics and cognitive modeling, from computer sciences, machine learning and artificial intelligence, from neurosciences, fMRI and MEG. He also acquires and analyzes large-scale data sets to reach reliable generalization of his results, and this includes, but not limited to, extensive samples of behavioral data from crowdsourcing platforms and then sampling of individual brains during neuroimaging. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, Martin, to our Bar-Ilan University Vision Science Seminar to share your exciting research with us, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for this really great and very kind introduction. And it's really great to be here. So thank you very, very much for the kind invitation. Today I will not be talking very much about the Things initiative. I've already mentioned this, but I will be talking a bit more about these approaches that we've been using for identifying meaningful dimensions from behavior, from patterns of brain activity, and from deep neural networks. So I think it goes without saying that all of you can immediately see and recognize the things around you when you open your eyes. You don't just see like a bunch of different colors or different shapes, but there's lots of meaning attached to the things that you can see, and you can immediately tell what the objects are, how they look, and maybe even what they're made of. And this act of perceiving requires you to connect what you know about the world with what you are sensing, right? So there's this connection happening, and it is really like effortless. So you can do this just automatically when you open your eyes, and it kind of hides how difficult the processing is that's kind of happening in your brain. So in order to highlight to you maybe the challenge of actually connecting what you see with how you make sense of it, what I'm going to do is going to break this connection in the next slide. So I'm going to show you images, but I'll try to break the connection between your ability to see and what actually comes out of the percept. Okay. So here are some of these examples. And with these images, what you can see is you can still see different colors and different shapes, but the meaning of these different objects escapes you. Now, at the same time, if I was going to ask you if this object up here is more of a man-made object or more of a natural object, I think most of you would agree that this is maybe more of a man-made object. So even though you can't necessarily recognize these objects here, you can still like start to make sense of like some of the aspects that you see. Now, the currently dominant view of how like we can like make sense of objects around us is that there's processing happening in the ventrovisual pathway for visual recognition, known as the WAD pathway. And if we now look at the back of the brain with this early visual cortex, we know that early visual cortex is involved in processing features like orientation or basic curvature or even like some texture elements. And now the general idea is that our brain is kind of combining these features into more and more complex combinations until at some point your brain has representations that are general enough to allow you for recognizing different objects. And for that, the idea is then in high-level visual cortex, we have category selective areas like specifically responding to faces, to scenes, to bodies, or to objects, among others. So according to this kind of view, early visual processing is really acting a bit more like a pre-processing stages, subserving high-level visual representations for object recognition. And now, according to this traditional view, this also means that if you really want to understand representations in visual system, well, then visual features kind of act as confounds for category selective object representations, right? So if you're interested in the representation of a hamburger, and I'm just using a hamburger because I really like hamburgers, I actually had one for lunch even today. So if you take the representation of a hamburger, then you would say that, well, maybe the background here is a bit of a confound, so you may want to remove this. And you're interested in having a representation that would then maybe be invariant or let's say at least tolerant to changes in like, let's say, you remove the color of it, or even like you're showing a pictogram, right? So this is really the traditional view where you want to say, okay, I want to have a representation of a hamburger, and it then has to be kind of tolerant to these kinds of changes. But the question I really want to ask here is actually really everything a ventral visual system is doing is just object labeling, right? So is that really the whole like goal of object processing? And if that's really the case, well, then I guess then the visual system is not doing very much more than like a little kid who you're like teaching to associate different categories with different words. But you can also ask like, well, aren't the visual features themselves not really part of the object's representation? So if you like take the example of this yummy slice of toast here, if you just change the color of it, you can turn that into something quite different that you may not necessarily want to eat. And if you take this image of this cute rabbit here, well, you can have like a different visual appearance of a rabbit. And all three of these examples are definitely rabbits, but I think you would probably treat them quite differently. So you may not necessarily want to bite in this rabbit's ear, right? So please don't. So what I want to propose in this talk here is that in the past, maybe there's been a bit of an overly strong focus on studying the ventral visual system in terms of recognition and high-level category. So the focus has really been very, very strongly on trying to abstract away these other kinds of features and really get at like what is the essence of the ability to recognize or categorize. But one thing that's kind of, I think, been swept aside here is that the way that we want to study object representations, and if we really care about object representations, then we need to detach this from how we name objects, and we should study and embrace the whole percept, so the entirety of the object, and not just the label that's applied to it. So in other words, if we're looking at the representation of, let's say, a rabbit, then we would also want to take into account the way that this specific instance that we are seeing right now is looking and all of the kind of relevant aspects that it has. So if you take this seriously, then this suggests a shift towards understanding core dimensions that span this representational space of objects, and that goes beyond category. So what could these core dimensions then be? Well, category could be one of them, or like different types of categories could be one of them. There could be more. And these dimensions would then form what I call like a behaviorally relevant scaffold of invariances, including category, but also moving beyond it, that's underlying our ability to generalize and make sense of the visual world. So this is a very, if you want, like philosophical slide, right? Because it's kind of highlighting the general line of thinking that I have here, but it's also really important. And that's why I like to spend a little bit of time on it, because I think that the way that we study the visual system has often been really focused on how we think about the world, and that we are the ones that are labeling the objects around us. And as soon as you're interested in, say, representation of a hamburger, then you have already like subscribed to this idea that you now want to abstract away. But now if you're looking at a specific instance, how does it look? Are there certain aspects of it that are requiring certain like processing of invariances like roundness, etc.? And these are the things that we are really interested in understanding, in my view. So I'm obviously not the first who has like proposed the idea of like these types of dimensions. And I think you can understand this like dimensional view from multiple different angles. And I just want to highlight, I think, like two dominant views here. So what you can call like binary and sparse dimensions, if you go now and look at the processing of categories, this is a very traditional kind of way of looking at it. So these would be like categorical dimensions, pretty much binary if you want, right? If you do it on the theory-driven side, you would have things like categories. If you come at it from a more like data-driven side, you can think about it like clusters or like dictionaries. And examples would be like faces, scenes, bodies, text, etc. The good thing is you get really interpretable dimensions, so this is really nice and really useful. But the challenge is that they really have like limited explainability of the global cortical pattern. So in other words, like you can only capture like that much of ventrovisual cortical activity, but you would need to move beyond this in order to be able to capture everything. On the other hand, there have been proposals for continuous, what I call continuous and dense dimensions. So these, from the theory-driven point of view, would be like continuous features. From a data-driven point of view, this could be done with like, or has been done in the past with principal component analysis and multidimensional scaling. And examples here would include things like animacy, real-world size, manipulability, stubbiness, etc. So again, what's really nice about this is that this can give you like nicely interpretable dimensions on the theory-driven side, but it would have limited explainability of the global cortical pattern, at least so far. Like we don't have like a set of features that is giving us really like comprehensive understanding. And from the data-driven point of view, yes, you can actually capture the global cortical pattern, but now we actually have the problem that we have limited interpretability beyond the first few dimensions. So when you run like MDS or PCA, you normally can only interpret the first one or two components, and after three or four, it just starts to break down. So what then are desirable properties of these kinds of dimensions that we're talking about here? And this is obviously in my view, but so you might disagree with this, but I think that these are desirable properties. One, I think, really is that sparsity is a desirable property. The reason is that each object only has some dimensions. If you, let's say, think about the representation of a cup, and you think about an animacy dimension, then the cup would have a value of 0. Right? So this would mean that in terms of animacy, this object would just have none of it, right? So this means that it's sparse in that respect. There's only a certain number of dimensions related to each individual object. I think continuity is another desirable property. So dimensions can be weighted differently, right? So this also makes sense because if you think about, let's say, animals, there's some animals that are more, like, say, prototypical than others. So you would say that, like, I don't know, if I think about a lion would be a much more like prototypical animal than, let's say, a mosquito, even though both of them belong to the category of animals, right? And this continuity should, I think, be taken into account. And then there's non-negativity, and I think that's one of the most important criteria here, that objects should be combinations of dimensions that cannot cancel each other out, right? And this kind of gives you a part space description, and that gives you the interpretability. So the fact that like a chair is something you can sit on, and the fact that a chair is something that has legs shouldn't have like negative interaction with each other, right? They should have only add up together to tell you, okay, this is a chair. So with these kinds of desirable properties in mind, how can we actually go about and identify these object dimensions that I've been talking about, right? So more like in a data-driven view. Well, one like really traditional approach in behavior has really been to look at similarity judgments, right? So how similar are different objects to each other? And based on that, you can then infer like certain types of dimensions. And another approach in like patterns of brain activities, you could actually relate voxel activity patterns. And again, you could look at how similar or how different they are. So now the remaining talk or the remaining time of the talk, I'll just be talking about like three different aspects of our work here. First, I want to talk about these like core dimensions in behavior, so revealing like core dimensions underlying our mental representation of objects. Then I want to go into dimensions in the brain. And then if we still have the time at the end, depending on how fast it will progress, we may also talk about core dimensions in neural networks and what this can actually tell you about the similarities and differences between humans and DNNs. The general theme I want to carry through all of this is like, well, is it actually really the case that category selectivity, or sorry, to be more precise, that the idea of understanding like categories is really the central thing of what we should be caring about, or is maybe a dimension-based view maybe providing a bit of a broader understanding? Okay, so let's start with the first part. So in order to address this idea of like these dimensions derived from behavior, there's different challenges we need to overcome, right? So the first one is that like traditionally, when people have been studying these similarity judgments, people have always like used a comparably small set of different objects that they compared, right? And that's great, but it also means that it limits your ability to draw generalizable inferences about these judgments that you get. And it will make it probably quite difficult to really reveal stable interpretable dimensions underlying these judgments beyond the first like few kinds of components. So in order to address this challenge, what we did is we expanded this, and we actually sampled a set of 1,854 nameable objects that we sampled representatively from the American English language. And this kind of forms the basis for the things data set and later the things initiative that Sharon introduced in the beginning. And then based on this, we want to identify these core dimensions from behavior. Okay, great. So now that we have these images that we want to work with, so how do we actually access the mental representations? And I already mentioned that you can use similarity judgments for this, and we want to use a very specific type of similarity task, which is known as the triplet odd one out task. So we'd be showing our participants three different stimuli, and they have to tell us which one of them is the odd one out. So you could say that maybe the dog is the odd one out because the dog is alive and the other two objects are not. You could say the apple is the odd one out because the apple is something you can eat, and the other two are not. Although, I mean, I guess in theory, you can eat a dog, but you shouldn't eat a dog, right? Well, you could say that maybe the object is round. And you could say that the car is the odd one out because the car is man-made and the other two objects are natural, right? So what you can see already is that there's many different ways in which you can kind of break up this task, many different kinds of decisions you can make. And these are the kinds of dimensions that we talk about, right? So if there are certain kinds of consistencies in which people have in making these types of decisions, that can actually tell you what these kinds of features are that are relevant for making these judgments. And then from that, we can infer what's kind of relevant in them, like making sense and kind of structuring the world around them, okay? And in this case, it could be a little bit more ambiguous, so people can decide differently or with different probabilities. And if I was going to use like this example here, I think then most people might agree that the apple is the odd one out. So the task is really good at emphasizing like the core dimensions. It's measuring the similarity independent of context, right? So you can look at the similarity of, say, these two objects marginalized across all other possible objects, because we have so many, and we can actually do this. So it's like interestingly also solving like a really old like problem that Tversky kind of posed in 1977 by just saying like the probability of choosing these two objects together is what the similarity of two objects is.
Is it okay to ask questions?
Sure. And I'm just finish the slide and then I'm more than happy to.
Thanks.
And I think that the task is also intuitive while minimizing response bias. In other words, people really like this. Yeah, please go ahead.
So this just sort of riffs off your prior points about all the different functional roles objects have. So you sort of said it's pretty obvious the apple's the odd one out. but that's under a sort of visual similarity or some kind of biological knowledge assumption. But for instance, if the question was something about eating things or which is edible, probably the dog would be the odd one out.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm also not saying this is like always and in all possible like circumstances going to hold, right? So I think there's a certain like dependency. But this is kind of the nice, really, I think the really nice thing is that if you're just asking about the general, so like the general way of structuring this. So let's say, for example, if I was going to have like a sheep and an apple in another triplet and then another not edible item, then edibility would still be factoring in, right? So it's all
Right.
certain things can be a bit more dominant in a certain triplet, but then another triplet kind of help you.
So I'm just wondering if there's a set of underlying assumptions that people are bringing to the task all the time that aren't completely transparent to us as the experimenters.
Yeah, I guess. So you mean like about the instructions, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big problem in like large scale data sets and computer vision too. There's these labeling set instructions tend to be very vague, and it turns out that people use all sorts of weird underlying assumptions about the categories that they didn't necessarily make explicit. So I'm not saying it's a critique of your thing, it's just another problem, sort of a level of what you'd already raised as being the different aspects of objects.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So as I said, like, I mean, if another way maybe of looking at this, right, is think of it as a categorization task, right? And what you're doing is you're forming like a minimal category, right? Like, so you're saying that these two things would be a category and the other one would not be, or something like that, right? Like, however you divide it up in the end. And I think the interesting thing is that like there are many different ways in which you can in principle form different categories, but certain types of categories just seem to be more natural than others, right? So people tend to agree on how they would be categorizing different objects. So even though you could in theory construe like a task where someone might be using something like differently. So you could say like, I don't know, you've seen like a show where sheep and dogs maybe appear together because the dog is going to chase. Oh no, let's make something that's unusual. Like let's say you would say that the sheep is the odd one out, and it just has to do with the fact that like I don't know, you've seen a show where a dog is always like eating apples or something like that. I don't know, just making this up. Then in this case, I guess that would probably not be the kind of the natural way that most people would do this. So this should, in principle, wash out in the noise, right? So we're thinking really about like extending the idea of natural categories that was introduced from like Eleanor Roche to like just be a bit more general and a little broader, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay,
Perfect.
cool. By the way, I'm sorry, I accidentally stopped screen sharing. I think, is my screen still visible?
Yeah, definitely visible.
Okay, perfect, great. So, okay, so now that we have a task, the next challenge that we have is like, okay, how do we actually get sufficient data, right? Because if you now use this triplet task on 1,854 objects and you do the math, you just see like, oh, okay, that requires like 1 billion trials. And I mean, my research funding is probably not going to cover all of that. So we said, okay, we're just not going to sample all of these triplets. We're only going to sample like a fraction of them. And actually going to sample a very small fraction of this. So we decided to sample using online crowdsourcing like 1.46 million responses, which like sounds like a lot, but it's actually only 0.14% of this fully sampled triplet matrix. Okay, so now we've sampled the data, but how do we actually get these dimensions, right? So how can we actually extract these dimensions? So for this, we're using a computational model. And the idea is really want to reproduce this assumed cognitive process underlying these similarity judgments. And we have these kinds of different criteria that we spoke about first, so sparsity. And this criterion we want to implement, we're using an L1 norm. So this gives us sparse dimensions. And the continuity and positivity we can get with a very simple non-negativity constraint. So in other words, these are really very basic and very simple kinds of constraints that we built in. And the procedure works as follows. So what we do is we initialize our modeling approach with 90 random dimensions. 90 is a completely arbitrary number that we start off with. And we have our 1,854 objects. So these are just random numbers in here that we start with. Then what we do is we extract each object's vector of 90 dimensions for like a given triplet that we have. And then we compute the dot product for each pair. And the dot product serves as a measure of internal similarity, right? So if the dot product, if these features align, then this will give us a larger dot product, right? Because it's just the sum of the product of all of the individual elements. And if they don't align, then the dot product will be smaller.
Martin,
yes.
can I ask a question? So
Sure.
how do you assign the 90 dimensions to each of the objects? Is this human judgments?
Yeah, no, these dimensions are really completely just random numbers. So in the moment, each one of these objects just gets 90 random numbers associated with it.
Random. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely random. So we start off complete.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So none of them have any meaning. They're just random numbers. Then what we do is we, based on this still like kind of random thing, we predict what is going to be the odd one out, right? So the highest similarity, the pair with the biggest dot product is going to determine then the odd one out, right? So let's say if the model says that these two have the highest product, then this one is the odd one out. So this is what the model predicts. But then what comes out is maybe that in behavior, we got like that the apple was going to be the odd one out. And now the magic part is really that we implement all of this in a computational graph, and we can now update the dimensions based on the misalignment in the prediction and the actual response in humans. And we can now tweak the weights in a way that they move towards giving us something that's closer and more in line with the behavioral responses. Okay, and if we do this like with only a handful of different choices, this will obviously still be noise. But if we do this with 1.4 million trials, after many rounds and many iterations, what we end up getting something that looks a bit like this. And I've already sorted the dimensions based on the weight. But you can see that there's a more or less like sharp cutoff here. And this cutoff is so sharp that you can just like visually inspect that there's not just like any like selection you have to do. You can literally say, okay, we can eliminate all of these dimensions because they're really close to zero. So we get the dimensionality back as well just for free. And we end up with 49 individual dimensions. So this is nice. So we now have this computational model, but how well does this model actually work? Okay, so what we do is we look at the prediction accuracy here, and where like 33% is like the chance. So this is like predicting each individual triplet choice, right, in our test set. And the ceiling, well, we call it noise ceiling. It's actually the misnomer. We should call it just like the inter-subject reliability. So this is like the best any model can possibly do based on the reliability of different people to each other, because different people give different answers, right? It's just a probabilistic task. So how well does this model do? Well, it turns out it actually doesn't do that bad at all, right? Like it actually is able to capture 92% of the explainable variance in this data set. So I would say it's actually doing a fairly good job. So then what we want to see is, okay, so this is nice, but how well does it actually do at predicting similarity? Because we have this like partially sampled matrix. So what we did is we just sampled for 48 objects. We've got a full similarity matrix with every individual triplet. And for this matrix, here's the prediction from the model, and this is the fully sampled matrix. And I think you can appreciate the similarity between these two, again, like kind of approaching or touching the ceiling that you can possibly expect given the noise in the data. So the model is predictive. It seems to be doing a good job. But now the most interesting part for us really was to see, can we actually now look inside these dimensions and start to make sense of them? So the first thing that it is like say, okay, why don't we just plot these dimensions and we just down project them in a way like something like 2 dimensions, and then we can see we can really see some structure. And indeed, what you see is there's certain types of clusters that seem to be emerging here. And now, if you look at these clusters, you can see that they actually correspond to what you would call different types of object categories, right? So you can see like animals here, or plants, or food, etc. here. And if I now want to quantify this, I can just do like some like high-level category prediction just based on our 49 dimensions, and we get back like an accuracy of 87 to 88%. And this was actually matching the performance of state-of-the-art sense embeddings. I have to say that just recently, like there's another one that just came out that was 2% better, but it's still, I would say, is just about like very, very, very good. Okay, so this is like the performance for like these categories. And I think one thing you can see is that you can, from these 49 dimensions, already get something from it. You kind of get categories for free to a certain degree. So this is actually quite nice. But now the question really is, are these dimensions interpretable? And to illustrate this, what I will do is like the following. So for a few example dimensions, I will plot the images with the highest weights for that dimension. And I will plot them like here. And to get a label for the dimension, I ask like 20 participants to name the dimensions, and I will plot the naming frequency here, right? And then finally, I'll just show the distribution of those dimensions in the embedding itself. Okay, so let's start with the first example dimension, which is pick dimension number 3. And you see that this seems to be corresponding to something that's very closely related to animals. Yeah, and you see the animal clusters really highlighted. But another thing that you might notice is that this is actually not restricted to animals, right? So if it was a purely like categorical thing, I would actually have to stop here. But in reality, what we see is there's actually weights also in other parts of the embedding. Really, and this is really what I meant with this kind of continuous nature. So to some degree, these different objects here seem to be also related in a way to animals. So this is not pure animal cluster. Here's another category, another dimension that seems to be related to things that like tools. This dimension here seems to be reflecting colorful things. And this dimension here seems to be reflecting circular around different things. And this one here, like patterns or piles or maybe fine-grained different kinds of things. So what you can see is that these dimensions are interpretable indeed, and they seem to be reflecting both like perceptual and also conceptual properties of different objects. Okay, so this is nice because you can see that it's like performing quite well. But then like a question we often got was, okay, so now you know that for these specific images, you can tell what these like different dimensions are, but that's not going to really help me that much with like another object image that I have now. Let's say you take a new image. And then I would have to tell people, yeah, I'm sorry, now you've got to collect like 1.5 million responses again, just to figure out like, where does this one object belong, right? And this is not very satisfying. So in order to address this, we asked ourselves, like, can we actually predict the similarity of novel object image pairs using a deep neural network? And this is work that we started like a long time ago, actually, like already like in 2019 or 2020. But this just like finally is out. So this work done by Philip Carney, a grad student, is just like finishing in our lab. And what he did is like he just did something very simple. He put images in a deep neural network. In the beginning, we used something like VGG, and then later when CLIP came out, we used CLIP. And then he's run simple linear regression on the DNA activations onto these 49 dimensions and doing it for each dimension individually. And then from this predicted similarities, he can now predict from these predicted embedding, he can now predict the similarity judgments for novel objects. How well does this approach work? So now if you just compare this to just representational similarity analysis, which reflects like the raw activations of the neural network, you get like a decent correlation, right? So you get a correlation of about like 0.5. If you now do something where you do like a feature reweighting, so you're trying to optimally change the individual like dimensions in the neural network to best match the similarity judgments, you get something that's much, much better. But if you now use this dimension prediction approach, you're again getting now a performance that's actually close to the best performance you can possibly achieve. So in other words, I think this is actually also like doing a fairly good job. And now you can do other interesting things, because now that we actually have this end-to-end approach, we can now look at what are the parts in an image that actually correspond to your similarity judgments or to different dimensions underlying these judgments. So for these 3 examples here, like the most important dimensions are like the 3 shown here. So for the chalkboard, the most relevant dimension was like body part, paper text related, or colorful. And you can see the different parts of the image that correspond to these. And now if you integrate across all of the dimensions, you can see that highlighted the different parts of the image that are relevant for the similarity prediction. And you can do this for other images as well. Other people have also been like looking into other kinds of spaces. So the space that we've been looking into was a space of objects. Now this has been extended to actions. Actually, the paper by Andre Bockes and Angelika Lingnau just came out in Communication Psychology this week. We've also been doing this on faces, with materials and material properties, and reach spaces, among others. People have also expanded this now to semantic descriptions and to text. So to summarize this first part, the one thing that we've shown, I think, is that the most relevant representations of these objects can really be captured with a small number of interpretable dimensions. And that's actually really nice because it helps you to break down this kind of complexity into like a manageable, like meaningful units. The dimensions can predict categorization behavior quite well. And also what I didn't show, the prototypicality of different objects. And now by just moving beyond category alone, this framework, I believe like offers a bit more of an explanatory power than like the traditional way of thinking about this. Okay. So having like talked about like core dimensions of behavior, just now I want to move on to the next part, which is like core dimensions in the brain, and really like trying to think about, okay, how does what we've kind of learned from the first part really like also translate to cortical patterns of brain activity. So in the past, when people have been looking at the relationship between human similarity judgments and fMRI pattern similarity, what people found was that the similarity of different objects was really most closely related to patterns of brain activity in higher visual cortex, right? So more like around like LOC and going more like an anterior and to PFUS. What this means is that, or the interpretation of this has been that maybe the regions that really matter the most for how we make sense of the world around us really seem to be more like related to higher level visual cortex. And this is also something that we replicated in our own data using things data set and applying this to patterns of brain activity. So this is like a flattened visual cortex, and you can see the back of the brain, and here's the front. So the traditional view has been like higher visual cortex seems to be reflecting object similarity judgments. So now what Oliver Contier in our lab, like another grad student in our lab, was asking, well, where do we actually find information about these behavior-derived dimensions? And what he did is he used a voxel encoding model using these behavior dimensions for all of these different images that we used. And this is what he found. He found actually that there was information all over the visual system, right? So it seems that there are certain aspects of these different like dimensions that are going into these similarity judgments that were not necessarily captured with these kinds of traditional approaches. And if you do a bit more of a fine-grained analysis where you allow each one of these dimensions to kind of come into play, what you can see is that all different parts of the visual system seem to be really mirroring the information that's captured in these types of dimensions underlying these similarity judgments. Okay, and this is really fascinating because this suggests, and those, of course, this is only correlative, but this suggests that there's like really like widely distributed information about these behaviorally relevant object dimensions, and it suggests that maybe even like earlier cortical processing stages may actually be involved in representing these behaviorally relevant information about objects. So what is the topography of these behavior-derived dimensions? So if you look at like a head-related dimension, you see something that's really like closely mirroring responses in face-selective regions, which is something that you would probably expect. If you have the what we call like the outdoors-related dimension, that seems to be mirrored more closely in scene-selective regions. And if you now take the body part-related dimension, no surprise, also like mirrored in body part-selective regions like EBA or FBA. But then beyond these kinds of known patterns, now we have also like other kinds of patterns that we can look at. There's like a food related response that we can see, which is something that has been shown by other labs like at a similar time, and that we've kind of found as one of our 49 dimensions also. Also very nicely here, something that you can see that I'm happy to talk more about is even like in early visual cortex, you find a nice correspondence here. And like something that's been related to like being thin or flat. or something that's more like coarsely patterned, again, like related more closely to early visual cortex. So in other words, these dimensions seem to replicate the known topographies, but also seem to uncover like new topographies that have not necessarily been described so much before. Okay, so now if we now look at it the other way around, and instead of trying to understand the topography of these different dimensions and understanding actually what different individual parts are doing in relation to individual objects. Now what we can do is we can look at the tuning of each brain region for different object dimensions, right? So what we would first do is what we call like identifying the tuning profile for each brain area. So this means that for our different types of dimensions that we have, we look at how well they actually fit these different brain regions, right? And you can see that like the food-related dimension, or like coarse patterned or oriented or repetitive and spiky dimension seem to be like captured quite nicely by, let's say, V1, or like in FFA, you see something like animal-related, body and people-related or head-related. But now the interesting thing is what you can do is you can now try to find like images that have a profile, like a dimension profile that looks exactly like these different dimensions in these areas, right? So try to find images that match this kind of profile here. And for this, we can use this approach that was introduced by Philip, where we just put a bunch of different images through. We do this for all of the things images now, not only the ones for which we have behavior, but for all of them, and to see like which images are kind of best suited for capturing these different brain areas. And this is what we find. So you can see that the responses in earlier visual cortex actually capture quite nicely. This really like seems to be corresponding quite nicely to what you expect from like early visual cortex responses. We see it's a bit coarser here in HV4, and then in like the category selective areas, you can see like that there's a nice correspondence here to different like kinds of features that you would expect, like faces here. It's more like animal faces in OFA. And scenes and something like PPA. So that this tuning for these behaviorally relevant dimensions really captures these known selectivity for visual brain regions, even though we're now only talking about this kind of low dimensional embedding here. We're not actually using anything else. We're just deriving this from the way that people make sense of the world. And I think this is actually quite fascinating that you can extract this rich information, even only based on the way that people structure the visual world around them. So then what is the explanatory power of dimensions relative to these high-level category? What we did is we, like thinking more about the traditional way of how people have been trying to make sense, right? So if you think just like how well does category explain the responses in the brain, and how well do these different dimensions that we have explain patterns of brain activity. So what we do is we carry out variance partitioning, and then we look at what kind of information is like shared between the different dimensions and the categories in explaining the brain, and what is kind of uniquely explained by categories and what's uniquely explained by dimensions. So here you can see the shared variance, which is really like tied mostly to like high-level visual cortex. Now, what's the unique variance? You can see that in the categories don't actually explain very much unique variance alone, and then the dimensions actually capture a lot of variance also, like again throughout the visual system, but also like specifically in earlier visual cortex. So category really only seems to be capturing part of this behaviorally relevant brain responses to objects. So then you can ask yourself, well, is then category selectivity maybe just a special case along the spectrum of object dimensions? So in other words, if the way that we've been studying the visual system, we've been looking at categories, right? And we're trying to find responses in the brain that are responding to certain types of categories. I guess then what we're first going to find are brain regions that have selectivities to only very, very few dimensions, right? So these brain regions seem to be selectively responding to very few things. But then there might be other regions that respond to 2 or 3 different things, or 5 or 10, etc., right? So can we actually see if we can use this idea of this sparseness or sparsity and see if we can identify whether like category selectivity is indeed maybe just like at the extreme end of the spectrum. So if we do this, we can ask ourselves where in the brain are the dimension profiles across these different dimensions that we measured very sparse. So if they are sparse, they only respond to very few dimensions. If they're dense, they respond to very many. And here's what we find. So these here are like the sparsest response profiles that we found. And you can see that they're like really closely tied to these category selective brain regions that have been found before. So in other words, if you find a very, very sparse response, chances are that this is like tied to a category selective area. Some like other kind of fun thing that I don't talk much about is like, we also have like this cluster here in the front. And in the beginning, I was super excited because I thought, okay, cool, we may have found like a new category selective area. And this area here was responsive to food stimuli, and specifically actually dessert stimuli, right? So I spoke with Jason Avery, who's like a colleague of mine. He studies food, and he worked as a postdoc with Alex Martin. And he said like, oh yeah, this is something that we've known for like quite a while, that this is like a food selective region. And I was like, okay, great. So didn't necessarily find this new blob in the brain. We actually do have like another one that I think is quite interesting. This one here that we find in all three of our subjects, and that is specifically tied to animal faces, but we don't go into much detail in the paper about this, because this is really like would require a lot of like additional analyses to really like nail this down. The whole point really of this analysis, I think, really was to highlight that in this idea of thinking about like representations as being like embedded in a multidimensional framework, right? Category selectivity is a real thing, but it seems to be tied more closely to like one end of the spectrum, and it's just like part of the story. Now, one other thing that we wanted to do then is to say, okay, so if this is really the case, if this multidimensional view really makes sense, why can't we just go into these category selective regions, and instead of like taking these externally like behavior derived dimensions, directly decompose the patterns of responses inside them, right? And this is what we do for this. We used a method that's known as Bayesian non-negative matrix factorization. And this is work led by Lenny van Dijk. And so he used, just as examples here, the FFA, the phase selective FFA, parahippocampal place area, and the extrastriate body area. And he tried to, like similar to how you would use principal component analysis for finding like axes that in this case would explain a lot of variance, but he decomposes matrices with the constraint of being like non-negative and giving you sparse representations, right? And this is what you can get with this Bayesian non-negative matrix factorization. And if you do this for these different category selective brain areas, what you find is there are indeed actually different dimensions in these different brain areas that correspond to different things. And one thing that I think is clear is that the most like strongest response in each one of these regions is really like tied to an FFA for faces, or an extrastriate body area for bodies, or in PPA for like for scenes. But that these different regions also seem to be responding to a certain degree, probably to much lesser degree, also to other types of like stimuli. And here just like some of the example dimensions shown here. So this data-driven dimension-based analysis really seems to be revealing overlapping multidimensional tuning within category selective clusters, right? And this is something that is just like hidden because there's such a strong dominance for the category selective signal that the other signals don't necessarily come out so easily. So now what you can do is you can now run a voxel encoding model of these dimensions and now look at where you find information about these different dimensions, right? So you take the face-related dimension from FFA and you look at where else you find actually responses. And you can see that these dimensions actually seem to transcend a border of the category selective areas, right? So you have a face selective response that's not restricted to the face selective area, but it actually extends beyond it. And the same holds for the body part related dimension in EBA, and the same holds for the scene related dimension in PPA. So what this means is that the idea that these dimensions from inside these category selective regions really transcend category selective boundaries. So just for the sake of time, I just want to finish with this part and just want to summarize it. So I hope I convinced you that the representation of dimensions capture the known topographies, but also reveal novel topographies. And the neurocorrelates of the mental representations really extend into earlier visual brain areas, suggesting that these behaviorally relevant signals are actually not limited to higher visual cortex, but actually extend into the earliest processing stages. Finally, the regional selectivity that we've found in the past may actually be better explained by a mixture of partially overlapping representational dimensions rather than just thinking about like strict categorical boundaries. So just to end the talk, and I'm just going to do this very quickly so we have enough time to discuss about this. Just want to briefly talk about core dimensions in neural networks and what determines the similarities and differences between humans and deep neural networks. So this is work done by grad student Florian Mahn in our lab. And what he said is, okay, so the way that we've been looking at representations in humans was that we collect odd one out behavior from these participants, and then we infer the dimensions from the human choices that they make. And what he was asking is, well, can we actually just replace the human here with a deep neural network? The idea then is that you take the deep neural network that you're interested in understanding, you take the layer of interest, in our case, it's the penultimate layer, which is the closest, you can say, from the neural network that's not already like tied to specific categories. You extract the activation for different object images. In our case, we do this for all of the things images. And now we can compute the odd one out from the similarities of these patterns to each other. We do this for 20 million triplets. You can do this for as many as you want, but we didn't have more compute power available, and it would just run forever. And now we infer the dimensions from like the DNN's choices. And now what you can see is that we can do something that's really nice, because now we've used the same approach in humans and in deep neural networks, right? And we can make them directly comparable this way. We can see, do we find similar dimensions in humans and in deep neural networks? And if not, like, what are the similarities and what are the differences? Yeah, and this is really something that's kind of hard to do if you don't have the same way of measuring the representations in both. So, I mean, someone else could ask like, oh, why don't you just directly decompose these dimensions here? Well, yes, you can do that, but then it's not directly comparable to how we got these kinds of measures in humans. So now you can ask, okay, so we get these dimensions back from this deep neural network, and you can ask, well, are these dimensions actually interpretable? And here's what we find. And indeed, it seems to be that these different dimensions are actually nicely interpretable, right? Like you think that, okay, this dimension here may actually reflect something that looks like food. This dimension here may reflect something that's like valuable, or like, I don't know, like something special. This is like technology. This is round. This may be like a fine-grained like mesh or pattern, right? And you could say like, okay, great. So this really seems to highlight that the neural networks are like very similar to humans after all. But one thing that's like stuck out to us was when we looked at these dimensions, it actually turned out that the dimensions that we found in the neural network were actually much more like visual perceptual. They were much more like related to the visual features in the images, and then seemed to be like a little less related to like the meaning or the like higher level semantics, if you want, the categories, etc. So what we did is we asked like participants to tell us whether a dimension was more like a semantic dimension, like more like high level, more like a visual dimension, like related to shape, color, texture, etc., or if it was a mix of the two. And this is what we found for humans and for like a set of different neural networks. And for humans, you found that many of the dimensions were in fact actually rated as being highly semantic, and a smaller set, like fraction of them was being rated as being more like visual. Whereas if you look at the neural networks, all of them actually show much less of a like semantic relatedness. They were actually much stronger on the visual side. And this is even more the case for like a self-supervised network that we tested that really showed like a very strong like visual bias here. So in other words, what we've identified here is like what we call like a visual bias, that these high-level deep neural networks seem to be structuring the visual world more according to visual features, and which is then like approximating the actual semantics, like the way that we would normally make sense of the world. But now you could say, but there are still like certain dimensions that really were like semantic. So why don't we compare them now? And this is cool because we can do this. We can directly now take the animal-related dimension humans, and we look at the animal-related dimension DNNs, and we can see where are they similar and where they're different from each other, right? So we plot them against each other, nice correlation of 0.7. And here you can see the examples that are high, like have high weights in either, and you can see that they like correspond to animals. But now what you can also do is you can look at examples where like the human would say that it's clearly animal related, and the DNA would say that, nah, this is nothing like an animal. And these are examples here. And you could say like, oh, obviously these are animals, right? So you can clearly see that there's a difference here in this dimension here. And vice versa, you can see for the deep neural network, there's certain examples that have like high weights in the animal related dimension, but very, very low weight in the humans. And the same kind of goes also for like other dimensions here. This is a very nice one because it's actually more of a visual dimension. And you can see that humans do something like string-like, whereas the DNN seems to be actually detecting certain types of edges, where you can see this quite nicely here, that all of these images have something that like an edge like this here. But this actually has nothing to do with strings. So it really seems to be that the DNNs don't really truly represent the meaning of the semantic information, but seem to approximate it only using visual features. So to summarize this last part, and more generally, I think just as a general summary, I think that studying interpretable dimensions can really aid our understanding of representations. I think it's been really great that we've been learning so much from studying these representational spaces and looking at the representational similarities and understanding this. But I think if we can actually get to the axes that are underlying these representational spaces, I think this has a lot that we can still learn from this. And at this very high, like conceptual level, I was trying to highlight that it might actually make sense to move away a little bit from like focusing on recognition invariance or recognition tolerance, and really actually highlighting that all of visual cortex may actually be involved in representing what we have right in front of us, right? And this makes a lot of sense because the way that we are able to make sense of the world around us is involving actually not only the label that we apply to different objects, but it's involving all different parts of the object that we see. So each percept is actually what counts, in other words. The representational dimensions framework seems to be a bit more of a powerful framework than this traditional category selectivity-based framework. And in the end, the comparison with the deep neural networks, when we use this approach, actually was revealing like novel limitations of the match to human representations. So with that, I'd like to end and thank my labs, both in like Gießen and in Leipzig, and all the great work that's gone into this, my funding sources, my all of the collaborators. And I also want to highlight that I'm currently searching for a PhD candidate. So if you're interested in reaching out, then just do so. And yeah, with that, thank you very much for having me, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Martin. This was really an exciting talk. And I want to invite everybody to unmute yourself, and let's give Martin a big applause. And so of course, I'm going to open the floor for questions, but I want to start by saying that one take-home message is maybe that we need to redefine the word or categories. Maybe categories is not what we think they are. And I also have a specific question about, I mean, I've got lots of questions, but I'll just ask one about the last result that you showed about the neural networks showing being more visually like rather than humans. And I want to ask if you think this has to do with the fact that you took a certain level in the neural networks, and if you would have taken another level in the hierarchy, maybe you would have found something that would resemble, maybe just moving more to the input level, you would get even more visual, and moving closer to the output level, would you get more, closer to human? I mean, because I assume that the tagging you used were the tags that were, trained, that the neural network was trained on. So yeah, that's my last question.
Yeah. So this is a really good question. And this is also something that we've been like interested in ourselves. So, I mean, there's two aspects to this, right? Like one is you could say like, well, VGG16, that's more like a visual network, and it's been like optimized for doing visual stuff. So it's not a surprise that we find this in VGG, right? I mean, this is what you can see here, right? I think there's two things you could say about this. One is, first of all, I don't necessarily know if object categorization, which is what the network has been optimized for doing, is really a visual task. I would personally actually call it more of a semantic task, because the different objects and what they are embedded in like in a taxonomy of different of different things, right? Like so the way that the network is kind of doing this, like, let's say, 1,000-way classification, right? Certain types of objects, the objects are not like clean examples of just being the object, right? There's always like other things on the object as well. And also the categories are not clean, even if like there was no background or other kinds of objects co-occurring with them, like they're not like super clean. So I don't necessarily think that you can that easily like separate vision from semantics when you have this kind of supervised approach. But it's possible, right? But then again, what we also found is that when we use like something like CLIP, which is clearly a semantic network, when we use the penultimate layer, we do find a little bit more of a semantic bias, but still like the visual bias is even stronger in CLIP. And a much more like visual network, we find the opposite, right? So that's one part. The other part is like, well, what about like other processing levels? So we looked at this, and I mean, there's one, we only did it one way, so that it's possible that we missed something, of course, right? But what we did is we just looked at different processing stages, and it really turned out that the dimensions there were much more visual, right? Like, so really like just like colors, orientations, very basic shapes. So really like our texture actually also, so really basic kinds of visual properties. So I think that if any, I think this is really something that comes at the later processing stage, where these like fully connected layers are kind of mixing all of the different kind of basic features, like they're still tied just like these feature maps together, and where this information is kind of integrated. We didn't look at it in CLIP, so I don't necessarily know.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Igor, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you. Thank you for the great talk, Martin. So, and I have two short questions. The first is, I wonder if your representational dimensions can, for example, predict or explain choices between very similar things, like 20 different coffee mugs, or different kittens in different viewpoints. This is the first question. The second question is about this intriguing result when you show that DNNs can predict human similarity judgments very well, especially if you use this representational dimensions instead of like just vector correlation. So can you tell a bit more? Is it you trained your neural network on these dimensions and then use them to predict them? Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, also really good question. So the first one, that's a tough one, because I mean, if you think about the sampling that we did, right? Like we have 0.1% of the matrix. If we now include, I mean, with 10 examples of a cup, like I can already tell you that it can't, because we don't include 10 examples of a cup, right? But even those fine-grained judgments, like things being specific to, let's say, a sheep versus a goat or something like that, right? We can barely distinguish between these two. And then that really has to do with the fact that just by chance, right? Like let's say we have I don't remember the exact number, but it's, I think, a fifth of the images are like animals. You can think about like the probability of having 3 animals, because I mean, as soon as you have like only 1 animal in there, people might say, okay, that's the odd one out. If you have 2 animals in there, when the other object is the odd one out. So you need 3 animals in there in order for them to being able to zoom in, right? And now it gets super sparse, right? So now we can do like these kinds of distinctions, still like to a certain level, but it at some point just starts to break down. right? So what we did is like in this paper for the dimension prediction, for example, we tried to test the limits of the approach ourselves, and just saw that like when you do these like dimension predictions for within category like similarity judgments, it actually works worse than just taking the neural network itself, right? And that makes sense, right? Because we don't have the information about this. There is more like recent work now from Lukas Muttenthaler, who's like a former grad student in our lab, and he's been looking into kind of getting the best of both worlds with neural networks. So it's kind of expanding on the work that grad student like Philip Canute has been working on, and he's actually managed to also bridge these doubles with a neural network. So it's kind of taking the information from the humans while still augmenting the neural network. It's work that's going to come out in Nature sometime this or next week, because it allows you to do this like very, very broadly, very generally. But yeah, so this is where we are at the moment. This is actually what the grad student that I'm recruiting is supposed to be studying. So the idea is that we want to do an adaptive sampling approach where we want to go really deeply into these dimensions. We want to figure out like, okay, we sample broadly, go within the dimensions, sample within dimensions, see how far we can get, and then see if we can use this information to also potentially like improve artificial neural network models. Cool. But wait, did I actually address your second question? Oh, the dimension prediction. So the dimension prediction works really by just doing ridge regression on each individual dimension. So it is surprisingly effective, even though it's so simple. But it in a sense, it kind of overfits to the distribution that you have, right? Like, I mean, it's not that it generalizes, and that's what I told you, right? Like, it doesn't generalize necessarily to similarity judgments beyond these kind of general similarity judgments, right? But for anyone, I mean, really mean this, right? Like for anyone who's doing similarity judgments broadly on objects, this, I think, will work. And I mean, we've been using this a lot now, and I think it's actually worked quite well. We could, for example, predict eye movement patterns by using these maps that I showed you, right? Like we use this to predict eye movement patterns to a certain degree. It actually works as well as the Etienne Koch model. So it's actually not bad, right? But I mean, it's not like state of the art, but it's actually not bad. So I think it's definitely like useful, but I'm sure there's ways of doing this better.
Thank you.
Cool.
Great. Martin, are you okay to take more questions?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, great. So Mike, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure, thank you. Interesting. So question about this last slide that you still have up. So we know more and more that the diversity of the data sets and the models makes a big difference in predictive validity. These models are pretty big, but then actually the things data set has sort of got its own set of inductive biases in terms of the kinds of images and things it's picked. So I guess it's just an editorial comment. I wouldn't put that much stock in the relative amount of semantic versus visual similarity for humans versus these models. It'd be more like the models relative to each other, maybe, but even there, it might have to do with diversity. I'm just worried that too much of it's driven by the particular stimuli selected, and then the stimuli you select to get your human judgments. This is just from the experience we had in looking at some similar sorts of things. And one of the things we did to try and mitigate that kind of issue is we looked specifically at what particular parts of the visual cortex benefited the most from particular kinds of content within the models, and then tried to do PCA on that and interpret them in some way directly rather than making relative claims. And then I just heard, actually, you probably haven't seen it because I just heard it yesterday, the Dino 3 people, which is a completely self-supervised model. So there's no semantics at all in it. And just released an archive paper where they're also comparing Dino 3 similarities to the NSD data set. So that's interesting as a baseline because there you've got absolutely no semantics put in there.
Yeah. I mean, maybe commenting on the second part first. We haven't looked at Dino V3, but it's a really good idea, and it's also something we should look into. What we actually want to do, or we're actually working on right now, is that we want to do a general comparison of the different networks to each other to actually understand not only like because like now this issue that we're dealing with, all of the models seem to be doing well, all of them seem to be predicting well, and we actually want to see, is this always based on the same kind of information, Or is it that the different networks are actually contributing maybe different information? And what are actually the dimensions that are learned by these networks? Are there similar dimensions learned by the networks? Are they different? We don't know, right? And it's actually surprising that we don't know this. And we're still like stuck at this level of just fitting like regression models or doing like similarity judgments. So we're hoping that we can maybe move forward in that direction. And I wouldn't be surprised if more recent networks actually have less of this bias that we report here. And I think it would be actually exciting if that's something that we would find, right?
You mean more recent supervised or self-supervised network?
I mean, either, right? But I think if Dino V3 can do it, that would be great.
I can almost predict it. Well, and you can actually see the data from Remy King's group. Again, they use a slightly different method, but again, it's going to get the earlier visual really well. It's going to do okay up to a level, but when you get to higher level regions of visual cortex, it begins to break down more.
Yeah. But I mean, here's the thing, like if you take the approach that Lucas was using, Lucas Muntenthaler, and I think his paper is coming out soon, right? And they seem to do like have this aligned model, right? And it seems to be like working really quite well at predicting similarity judgments, like also fine-grained similarity judgments. Now you take something that one of the reviewers asked them to do is take like the Gemini model. And they do this with a Gemini model. The Gemini model just makes predictions, and the Gemini model is almost as good. I mean, it doesn't do very well at the very fine-grained judgments, but the general ones, it's actually really good. So I wouldn't be surprised if these models actually end up being like also having less of a visual bias at some point. I think maybe it would be good. I mean, I would like it if the models were actually approaching the kinds of like distributional statistics that humans are using. Although
yeah, I guess my prediction would be Dino V3 will have more of a visual bias, and then
Dino V3 I would probably agree with, but like modal models, I think
because then you're going to injecting more language into the whole thing, and therefore more semantics. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
So anyway, all right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, and there was another thing with semantic versus visual, but where you said like this could have to do with the training data, things data set, and I mean,
because we just know that all the data sets have a set of biases built into them intrinsically, and then there's been a bunch of results showing that data set diversity matters a lot more in brain prediction than we realized.
No, I agree, and I think it would be interesting because when we want to try getting similarity judgments now from like this new data set that we've just acquired, right? Like in getting a much broader view. Like also using, so this is like a big new fMRI data set I can kind of preview where we collect like 40 sessions in 7 Tesla. Like,
this is the neuromod one?
No, this is a new one that we just finished collecting where we used like Lion images.
Okay.
Do you remember like when we discussed this where we this broad sampling? So we have like fMRI data for that now. And I think it would be interesting to see what kinds of dimensions we find if we also like did behavior on these types of stimuli, right? Because they really like sampled to be as like kind of representative as possible, at least to see if we find similar dimensions, right? And I have a hunch. I mean, I can't necessarily, we don't have empirical data for this, but what we have is we have dimensions from other kinds of similarity like tasks that people have done. So we've done like materials. We've done different types of these like graspable scenes. We did like actions, right? And there's certain types of dimensions that seem to occur across these different spaces, and that is actually really interesting. So one thing that we did, and that's a little crazy, is we took the dimensions that we got from materials, and we applied the dimension prediction framework where we like use a neural network to predict the material dimensions, and we applied them to the objects that we have, right? I mean, this is like you wouldn't get these types of judgments when you ask people because we don't ask them about materials, we ask them about objects, right? And then we can now get the predicted dimensions for the material dimensions for these objects. And now what we can do is we can align for a given object, right? Like what kinds of dimensions are like aligned between the material space and the object space, and you see a certain degree of alignment. It's actually not small. We get like a correlation of up to point. I don't want to lie. It was a high correlation. It was bigger than 0.5, but I don't want to lie, I can't remember the exact number. But I was really surprised, right? Because what this indicates is that these spaces seem to overlap, right? And these stimuli will be completely different. So in other words, I think that I wouldn't be surprised if these dimensions that we found would also generalize to other kinds of stimulus spaces. But yeah, we don't know.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So I'm asking again because there are more questions, if it's okay for you to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. We can just keep going.
Okay, so
you already
there are
told me this can be longer enough. I've prepared.
three upcoming individuals. So let's start with Yarden. You're up next. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
And thanks for a great talk. It was really a pleasure to hear. I have two questions. The first one is like a kind of a more physical one that I was wondering about the spatial organization of the representations that you told us about. Maybe I kind of didn't fully understood it when we were talking about sparse representation, but is there like a kind of equivalent to this pinwheel organization that we have in V1 that you found in your study? And the second question is, do you have any clue how to relate the findings that you report of to the basic ideas of the manifolds and so on in relation to the single neuron levels that are reported, for example, by Livingstone and similar studies?
Yeah, no, these are really good questions. Spatial organization, I mean, first of all, the claims that we're making are more like at a very broad spatial scale, right? Like when we talk about like these category selective blobs, right? We're talking about these coarse scale gradients that people have reported. So we're not making specific claims about like neuronal tuning at the individual neuron level, right? Like we're doing this at this like coarser scale. So, and this is also like a misunderstanding sometimes, I think, that some people think that we're making here like extreme claims about like neuronal tuning at like a very coarse level, and we can't do this, right? Like but at the same time, I mean, most people who are using fMRI, they are talking about these coarse scale gradients, they are talking about category selectivity. So I think this kind of domain, I think there's something interesting or potentially interesting that we can say, right? And that we can contribute. Now, when we talk about the single neurons, it turns out that we have actually started to look into this as well. So at three different fronts. So one is that we've been looking into responses in the medial temporal lobe of patients with epilepsy. So for whom we've like collected single neuron, like we have single neuron data. So how do we get single neuron? Well, it's based on spike sorting, right? But these are like really really high quality responses. We have like hundreds of neurons actually collected for like I don't know the exact number of stimuli, but it's hundreds of stimuli. And we started to look into the representations in there. And this is like ongoing work, so I can't like say much about this at the moment. Another direction is that we have monkey recordings in V1, V4, and IT, where we're also looking into the representations there. This is actually at the unit level, so we don't have like the single cell, but this is at the unit level. I think it's interesting there to think about the relation to what like the kind of, I personally, I like the framework that Doris Zhao has been proposing, right? Like, I mean, just thinking about these different axes and like this, like spanning this representational space, right? And she's been describing this as, that's, for example, a spiky stubby versus animate inanimate, right? And this is like from a specific kind of way of thinking, this actually makes a lot of sense. The approach that they normally use is like they take a neural network to provide the kinds of axes, and then they want to see if these axes actually are found, right? And this is an approach that they've been doing now for several like different domains. They've done it in phases. They've also expanded this into humans now, and also based on like, I think they use 50 the first 50 or first 80 or something PCs, right? And find that the neurons can kind of be explained with this. One thing that one can, when you take the framework that we kind of thinking about here, this multidimensional framework, one thing you can in principle do is you can compute for single neurons actually a multidimensional tuning as well. And it's, sorry, just for the sake of time, I won't go into details how you can do this, but you don't necessarily need the intermediary neural network. I think you can actually derive this directly using similar approaches that we've been using in fMRI. And I would be really keen on seeing what comes out of this. And we haven't started this yet because this is like, there's only this many people in your lab, right? But this is really something I'd be very, very interested in. And we want to start looking at this in the monkey data first, and then actually maybe you can even extend this to the humans.
Thanks a lot.
Cool.
Great. And Lucia, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Hi, thank you so much, Martin. That was like really lovely talk and so much interesting stuff. I think there was something that I didn't understand fully. It was the last part about the deep neural networks. So as I understood, you did that part, the deep neural network was the participant, right? And I was wondering if you could do the reverse. So when you showed at the beginning that you had 90 dimensions that were random numbers, so could you use the deep neural network descriptions there to then use the behavioral data to train by backpropagation what those dimensions grouped into? And would that get semantic things or just visual thing? What would that get? And as I understood, you didn't do that, right? Or am I missing something?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand what you mean with like DNN descriptions.
So so if you had a description of a layer for each image, and then you would train back how if that could predict the behavioral results in the odd one out task.
In the machine? Sorry, in the neural network, you mean?
Yes.
The network behavior? And what are the...
So if that then you would be able to find out which dimensions, how many dimensions need to exist in this neural network to be able to predict that behavior. Does that make sense?
Okay, and what is the behavior then? Sorry, this is the only part I don't quite understand.
The behavior meaning the actual people's behavior. So instead of so at the beginning, you had 90 random values by the 1,000 pictures. Instead of having that, if you could have a vector of the description from the neural network. Does that make sense? And would that give you some measure of how that information that layer is extracting corresponds to the behavior?
Yeah, I guess that's so in other words, you're saying, why not just take the activations from the neural network to predict the odd one out judgments in humans?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is great. So this is actually also something that like Lukas Muttenthaler did in an iClear paper like a couple of years ago, and he compared all different neural networks and to see like how they would perform on the odd one out task. And I think this was also done by Eric Schultz's lab. So they also looked into something like this, like Chan et al. So this is definitely possible, and they correspond to different degrees. But like none of them in any way like approach human behavior out of the box. The best one out of the box is Google Gemini, it seems, at least at the moment. We have played a little bit with fine-tuning like some of these state-of-the-art models, because you can also fine-tune them, right, to a certain degree, and that gave us surprisingly good results. So the performance of the model with humans, right, is 64%. This is our model. The ceiling that we have is 66 to 67. So that's like, there's not so much room, right, for improvement. by the way, why don't we get at the ceiling? Because there's maybe something that we can't capture with these linear combinations of dimensions, right? There might be some rule-based decisions happening on top, right? Beyond just like these axes. But the best model that after fine-tuning that of the kind of out of the box kind of models that existed until recently was 60%, even after tuning them, right? Before tuning, they were like 50 or something, like really bad. And now the more recent ones, like as Gemini, they go up to 61, 62%, so much better. I mean, 60 to 62 is a big step. 64, that would be crazy. If I ever see the model performing on par with humans, I would be like pretty amazed.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Martin, thank you so much. There's another question in the chat. Should I be reading it to you, or are you already, have you had enough?
No, it's really okay. I mean, if you don't mind.
Yeah. I can read it. So Suresh, who is, no, maybe he's not here anymore, but I'll read it to you. I hope, I'm not sure I understand the question itself, but does it make sense to do, or have people already done an odd one out task where the effect of the current hypothesis for odd one out weights that particular dimension in the neural representation for this? Objects could be represented serially and perhaps repeated within a trial, or fixations monitored on a fixed display. So
yeah, no, it's a good question. So
okay.
I mean, the question is like, this is something that people ask a lot, right? Like when you do like some external task and then you relate that to patterns of brain activity when people are doing something different, like isn't there like maybe a task specific kind of effect? I guess, I mean, it's not necessarily, in our case, it's not necessarily relevant, right? Because you could say, well, these are general kinds of representations that you just have when you see the world. But you could also say like, no, this really matters, right? There's a lot of like task relevance here. So I think it's a good question. I don't know. My suspicion is that it may not like matter all that much, but it would be interesting to see like even like a temporal domain, right? Like how do people access this information? Is it just hardwired? Is it just like there and then like it's kind of like probably not fully feed forward because you have to compare the stimuli, but it's kind of like a kind of fixed way it is? Or is it something where you have different kind of levels? Oh, it's not this kind of dimension, it has to be this. Oh, all of these are animals, so it can't be this dimension. And that's something that I think we currently don't know. So I think it's definitely something interesting.
Okay, great. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And I know some have already left because the discussion was rather thorough, but it was really exciting and interesting. And I do have additional questions I'm going to email you about. And so it was a pleasure having you to open our this year's series. Next week, we're going to have an in-house seminar, so it's not going to be online, but in 2 weeks, we're going to have Caroline Robertson from Dartmouth, who will be also joining us. So yeah, we're expected to have a really great series of talks. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Martin, again, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And
Thanks a lot for
yeah,
having
have
me.
a lovely year.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.